Okay, so this presentation is on cognition, also known as thinking. So basic definitions. When we're talking about cognition, we're talking about these kind of purposeful mental activities. So we're looking at acquiring, so that's learning information, retaining that information. So think of this as like holding on to it or storing it, and then also being able to use that information. Thinking then consists of being able to manipulate mental representations. So we'll talk a little bit more about what that means, and then using those mental images or representations to basically draw conclusions, to kind of come up with a solution to a particular problem. And then these mental images are basically kind of stored ideas that our brains have about objects, so the way that things look, the pattern that something should follow, or events. So clearly, we have many of these kinds of patterns that are stored in our head, even in the absence of a particular object. So when we're talking about cognition, we want to kind of break it down into different parts or different pieces. So one of these pieces is what's called a concept. So a concept is basically some kind of category that we have created within our brains, where we are grouping together basically things that are related to one another. So these can be groupings of objects, of activities, of other abstractions, of qualities, but the one thing is that they all share something in common. So for example, you have a mental category in your head for the concept of emotion. And under that concept, then, that category contains specific emotions. So anger, joy, fear, contempt, all of those things go into that category concept of emotion. Within our concept categories, we also have what are called prototypes or prototypical examples. So a prototype is basically some example within a category that really conceptualizes what that category stands for. So it's especially representative. It's basically like the first example that comes to mind if I say, give me an example of a bird. So the first thing that comes to mind for you might be a parrot. You probably didn't think chicken, right? So a chicken would not be a prototypical example of a bird, but perhaps a parrot would be. If I ask you to give a prototypical example of a flower or a very common flower, maybe you would say a rose. You probably didn't say hibiscus or gardenia. Those are not especially representative. They're not the first examples that come to mind. Okay, so if we're talking about prototypes, let's define it to some other specific examples here. So you define a chair, right, based on this mental representation. So based on the image that your brain has stored for what a chair should look like. Okay, so you have these stored images in your brain, and then you basically use that to categorize, right, to kind of make sense of the world around you, to perceive something that looks like a chair. It has four legs, it has a place to sit down, maybe it has a back to it, maybe it has armrests, but you basically match up the features of the actual chair with the example that is in your mind, right, with that mental representation, that mental image. So out of these examples that are provided here, which is your prototype for a chair? My guess is it's probably this one here, right? That this woman is, I believe she's pregnant, and she is sitting on what looks like a chair, right? So these kind of fit the concept of a chair. So even though all of these things could technically be considered chairs, they're probably not the first thing that came to mind. My guess is the first thing that came to mind is the picture of this woman right here. Okay, so problem solving. Let's talk about some different approaches that a person can use to solve a problem, which is basically to try to figure out some kind of resolution, right? Some kind of resolution to a problem. So the first approach that we might use is trial and error. So with trial and error, we're basically trying out different possible solutions. And if one solution doesn't work, we move on to something else. So sometimes this can be useful when we have to have some kind of very, very precise solution to a problem. So your book uses the example of inventing a light bulb. It's a fairly precise solution. However, it is not always useful. So sometimes it's just not practical. And if there is a very clear solution that is already available to you, trial and error might actually overlook this, right? Because trial and error is trying out so many alternative possibilities that perhaps it overlooks the obvious solution. Another approach that we might use is something called using an algorithm. So an algorithm you may remember from math courses, and with an algorithm it is step-by-step process. Okay, so you're usually applying some kind of formula and it guarantees a solution. Okay, so it will give you a solution. It might not always be the best solution to your problem, but it will guarantee a solution. An example of an algorithm is using a recipe to make a birthday cake, for example. So the algorithm, which is the recipe, specifies exactly how much of each ingredient you need to combine and in what order, and the temperature that you need to bake this at. And if you follow those steps in the procedure of the algorithm, you're guaranteed the result of a cake. You might also use what are called heuristics. So heuristics are also referred to as a rule of thumb. So a heuristic is kind of like a shortcut, a mental shortcut to trying to solve a problem. So you might use something that quickly arrives at a solution, but it might not be the optimal solution. Okay, so a heuristic is like applying a rule of thumb. And then the final problem solving approach is something called insight. So with insight, this is like the aha moment, like, oh, a solution just came to me, right? You might also refer to it as this kind of intuition, right? You kind of feel like you have a solution, and perhaps the solution seems to have come out of nowhere. Okay, so problem solving examples. Let's say that you are in the grocery store and you want to solve the problem of finding the apple juice. How do you do it? What do you do? Okay, so if you are using trial and error as your problem solving solution, you're going to walk around the supermarket, every single aisle, until you find what you're looking for. That can take a long time though, right? If you're using an algorithm, you're going to create a methodological path to check every single aisle. Okay, so every single thing in every single aisle, you will check every single item. Whew, also very time consuming. Now, if you use a heuristic, maybe your heuristic is apple juice should be located in the same place as other juices. So that's your rule of thumb, and you are applying that then to only checking related aisles. Okay, so that will perhaps save you some time. So there are also some obstacles that we face in terms of effectively solving problems. Okay, so some of these are what's called a confirmation bias, fixation or mental set, and then heuristics. And we'll talk about each one of these in greater detail. So first, the confirmation bias. So with the confirmation bias, the name basically tells you what's going on here. You only pay attention to information that essentially confirms or supports what you already think. Okay, so let's say that you are a reporter and you are supposed to be writing an article on the current presidential administration. So right now we have a Democratic president. Let's say that this reporter is also a staunch Democrat, so this reporter supports the Democratic Party. Maybe this reporter in her reporting will only focus on sources that also basically support or confirm what she already thinks. So she will only look for sources that are supportive of the Democratic Party. She won't look for things on the other side of the issue. So clearly that's a problem, right? If we're only looking for information that supports what we already think, we're only getting one side of the story. We can also have problems due to mental set. So with mental set, this is basically trying to solve problems in ways that have worked before. So this can be a good thing, right? If we're solving a problem, especially if it's a similar problem in a way that was effective in the past, this can basically be like a little shortcut for us in terms of solving problems quickly and efficiently. So this is a good thing, but it is not always a good thing. Sometimes we have problems that call for a new approach. Okay, so problems that basically require that we think about this in a different way. So here's an example. All right, so this is called the 9-dot problem. So you are to trace a line that connects all 9 of the dots. The line has to be continuous, so you cannot, take your pencil off the page, and you can only use 4 lines. So pause here and try to do this particular problem. And when you're ready to move on to see the solution, unpause and advance to the next slide. So the 9-dot problem solution basically requires that you have to think outside the box. So that's being able to break out of this mental set, to break out of this fixation. So to solve this problem, you could do this, right? So basically mental set requires that you have to break that mental set because you are going outside of the box, right? You're basically going outside of the lines, which most of us would not think to do that in solving this particular problem because our mental set, again, a procedure that's worked in the past to solve problems, tells us you have to stay within the box. But those were not in the directions, right? So you have to break mental set to be able to solve this problem. Okay, how about 3 straight lines to connect the dots? Here's the solution for this one. Crazy, right? So again, breaking out of that mental set, having to think outside the box to be able to solve this particular problem. So when problems call for a novel approach, mental set is not such a great thing, right? In some ways, it actually makes it harder for us to solve problems. All right, so we also use some other approaches in reasoning. Okay, so trying to, again, kind of think about our position on certain issues, things that kind of get in the way. So the first is called the affect heuristic. Okay, and remember, heuristics are like a rule of thumb, right? So with the affect heuristic, affect refers to emotion. So with the affect heuristic, we have a tendency to consult our emotions in solving a problem as opposed to rationally, systematically, logically solving a problem from start to finish. So we might ask you, how do you feel about a topic instead of looking at it from the pros and the cons of a particular topic. The availability heuristic is that we tend to overestimate the probability of certain events based on how available, okay, or how salient, how easy it is to think of examples of particular events. So insurance companies really take advantage of this, right? For example, we overestimate the likelihood that a plane is going to crash, right? So there are many people who are petrified of airline travel because they think it's so dangerous because of this availability heuristic. So they can conjure up, they can think of several examples of plane crashes that have happened relatively recently, but we know statistically speaking that air travel is one of the safest ways to travel. It's much safer than driving in your car. But because of things like media coverage, when there is a plane crash, these events are very salient, they're very available, and then we tend to overestimate how often or how likely it is that something like a plane crash will actually happen. Okay, we also use something called a hindsight bias. So with a hindsight bias, this is basically the I knew it all along phenomenon. So once we know the outcome of an event, we overestimate our ability to have predicted that particular event. So for example, let's say that you just found out the results of an election and you say, oh, well, I knew that she was going to win. No, you didn't, right? You're basically showing the hindsight bias where you knew it all along, right? Or you think you knew it all along now that you know the actual outcome. Another example, if you have, let's say you had friends who are dating and then you find that these friends are not together anymore and you say, I totally knew that that relationship was not going to last. you're basically showing the hindsight bias because now you know it's ended. You say, oh, well, I knew it all along.